What transforms mockery into terror in the span of just 4 days? Picture the Imperial Japanese Navy in the spring of 1944, confident in their convoy operations despite mounting losses throughout the Pacific. Their commanders had grown accustomed to American submarine attacks, developing countermeasures and tactics they believed adequate to protect their vital shipping lanes. Then intelligence reports began circulating about a particular American submarine whose crew claimed an unusual specialty: hunting destroyers, the very warships designed to hunt submarines. Japanese naval officers laughed at the audacity. Destroyers were submarine killers, armed with depth charges and sonar, fast enough to run down any submerged vessel and deadly enough to send it to the bottom. The idea that a submarine would deliberately target these predators seemed absurd, suicidal even. But their mockery would not last long. In just 4 days, one American submarine would sink 5 Japanese ships, including multiple destroyers, turning derision into dread and forever changing how the Imperial Japanese Navy viewed the underwater threat prowling their waters. This is the story of USS Harder, submarine number SS-257, and her legendary commander, Samuel David Dealey. It is a tale of audacity, skill, and relentless aggression that exemplified the best of the American submarine force during World War II. The submarine service operated in conditions of extraordinary danger, beneath the waves where a single mistake could mean death for the entire crew. Yet men like Dealey and his crew on Harder sought out the most dangerous targets, engaged the most heavily defended convoys, and turned the strategic equation in the Pacific on its head. The 4 days in question, from June 6 to June 9, 1944, represented the culmination of Harder's aggressive patrol tactics and Dealey's innovative approach to submarine warfare. What Japanese commanders initially dismissed as American propaganda or exaggeration proved to be devastating reality. The transformation of submarine warfare in the Pacific theater during World War II represented one of the war's most significant yet underappreciated campaigns. While American submarines constituted less than 2% of the U.S. Navy's personnel, they accounted for approximately 55% of all Japanese shipping losses during the war. This extraordinary effectiveness came at a terrible cost. The submarine service suffered the highest casualty rate of any branch of the American military, with 52 submarines lost and over 3,600 men killed. 1 in 5 submariners who went to war did not return. Yet these men persevered, taking the war to Japanese home waters, strangling Japan's economy by cutting the shipping lanes that supplied the island nation with raw materials and finished goods, and eliminating warships that the Japanese could not afford to lose. The audacity of submarine operations in the Pacific cannot be overstated. These vessels operated thousands of miles from friendly bases, in waters controlled by the enemy, without possibility of air support or surface reinforcement if things went wrong. A submarine detected on the surface faced almost certain destruction from aircraft or surface vessels. A submarine detected while submerged faced depth charge attacks that could crush the hull like an empty can. Mechanical failures that would be minor inconveniences for surface ships could be fatal for submarines. Fire was particularly terrifying in the confined spaces of a submarine, where smoke could suffocate the crew before flames consumed them. Yet submariners faced these dangers patrol after patrol, mission after mission, year after year. The United States Navy entered World War II with a submarine force that was, on paper, formidable, but in practice deeply flawed. American submarines were modern, comfortable by submarine standards, and capable of long-range operations across the vast Pacific. The fleet submarines of the Gato and Balao classes could cruise for 75 days without refueling, travel 11,000 miles at cruising speed, and dive to depths of 300 feet or more. They were armed with 10 torpedo tubes, 6 forward and 4 aft, and carried 24 torpedoes. These specifications suggested vessels capable of devastating attacks against Japanese shipping. Reality proved far more complicated. The most critical problem facing American submariners in the war's early years was the Mark 14 torpedo, a weapon so fundamentally flawed that it bordered on criminal negligence. The Mark 14 suffered from multiple catastrophic defects. Its magnetic exploder, designed to detonate beneath a target ship's keel and break its back, frequently malfunctioned, causing premature detonations or complete failures to explode. The contact exploder was too fragile, often shattering on impact without triggering detonation. The torpedoes ran approximately 10 feet deeper than their set depth, causing them to pass harmlessly beneath shallow draft vessels. These problems were not secrets to the submariners firing the weapons. Patrol after patrol returned with reports of torpedo failures, of perfect attacks that resulted in nothing because torpedoes refused to explode. Yet the Bureau of Ordnance, responsible for torpedo development, refused to acknowledge the problems for nearly 2 years, insisting that the weapons were fine and that failures resulted from crew incompetence. This institutional failure cost lives and missions. Submarine commanders watched in frustration as torpedoes that should have sunk enemy warships instead passed beneath them or bounced off their hulls without exploding. The psychological toll was immense. Submarine attacks required closing to ranges where enemy escorts could counterattack with depth charges. Crews risked their lives to achieve firing positions only to watch their weapons fail. Some commanders lost confidence in their torpedoes and became overly cautious, unwilling to risk their boats and crews for weapons that did not work. Others persevered with aggressive tactics despite the handicap, achieving what successes they could with unreliable weapons. The torpedo scandal represented a broader failure of pre-war testing and procurement procedures. The Mark 14 had been developed during peacetime under severe budget constraints that limited testing. Live fire tests were expensive because each test consumed a torpedo that cost $10,000, equivalent to roughly $200,000 today. To economize, the Navy conducted most tests with exercise heads rather than live warheads, assuming that the mechanisms would function identically. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The magnetic exploder was particularly problematic because Earth's magnetic field varies significantly with latitude and local geological conditions. Tests conducted in one location provided data that did not apply to other locations, but the Navy failed to recognize this limitation until combat experience forced acknowledgement. The depth-keeping problem stemmed from inadequate understanding of torpedo hydrodynamics. The Mark 14 ran deeper than set because its designers had not properly accounted for how the torpedo's weight distribution and control surfaces interacted at operational speeds. Submarine commanders in the Pacific discovered this through painful trial and error, setting torpedoes to run at shallower depths than intended target draft and observing whether hits occurred. Some commanders conducted their own systematic tests, meticulously documenting results and sharing findings with other boats. Eventually, the accumulated evidence became impossible to ignore, and corrections were implemented. But the process took nearly 2 years, during which countless opportunities were lost, and submarines were placed in danger for attacks that could not succeed. The resolution of the torpedo crisis came only through the persistent efforts of submarine commanders who conducted their own tests, documented problems meticulously, and eventually forced the Bureau of Ordnance to acknowledge reality. By mid-1943, fixes had been implemented that made the Mark 14 torpedo a reliable weapon. The magnetic exploder was deactivated in favor of contact detonation only. The contact exploder was redesigned to be more robust. Depth-keeping mechanisms were adjusted. With reliable torpedoes, American submarines transformed from frustrated hunters into deadly predators. Samuel David Dealey assumed command of USS Harder in August 1943, after the torpedo problems had largely been resolved, but while submarine warfare in the Pacific remained extraordinarily dangerous. Dealey was 29 years old, a 1930 graduate of the United States Naval Academy, who had worked his way up through the submarine service. He was married with 2 children, a family man who wrote loving letters home between patrols. His service record marked him as competent and reliable, but gave little indication of the aggressive, innovative commander he would become. Something about commanding his own boat, about bearing ultimate responsibility for his crew and mission, brought out qualities that made him exceptional. Dealey came from Texas, born in Dallas in 1914 to a middle-class family. His path to the Naval Academy was not unusual for the era, a combination of academic achievement, political connections that secured a congressional appointment, and personal determination to pursue a naval career. The Academy instilled in him the technical knowledge necessary for naval service and the leadership principles that would guide his command decisions. But the Academy could not teach the intuitive grasp of tactics or the aggressive spirit that would define his submarine command. Those qualities emerged through experience and the pressures of combat command. His early career followed the standard progression for submarine officers: qualifications in submarines, service aboard multiple boats in various positions, steady advancement through the ranks. By the time he assumed command of Harder, he had accumulated years of submarine experience and had observed multiple command styles from other officers. He understood what worked and what did not, what inspired crews and what demoralized them. Most importantly, he had developed firm convictions about how submarine warfare should be conducted, aggressively, innovatively, and with absolute confidence in the crew's abilities. Dealey's approach to submarine warfare emphasized aggression and initiative. He believed that submarines should hunt actively rather than waiting for targets to come to them. He sought out heavily defended convoys rather than avoiding them. Most controversially, he deliberately targeted destroyers and other anti-submarine warfare vessels, turning the hunter-hunted relationship on its head. Traditional submarine doctrine held that destroyers should be avoided when possible. They were small, fast, maneuverable targets difficult to hit with torpedoes. More importantly, they were specifically designed to kill submarines, equipped with sonar, depth charges, and trained crews. Engaging them meant accepting significant risk for relatively little reward compared to sinking cargo ships laden with vital supplies. Dealey saw the situation differently. He recognized that destroyers escorting convoys were the primary obstacle preventing submarines from attacking the valuable cargo ships. If the destroyers could be eliminated, the merchant vessels became easy targets. Moreover, destroyers were valuable warships that Japan could not easily replace. Sinking them degraded Japanese anti-submarine capabilities, and if done repeatedly, would force Japanese commanders to divert additional escorts from other duties, spreading their forces thinner. Finally, there was a psychological dimension. Destroyer crews knew they were hunters, dominant predators in the submarine warfare environment. Having that confidence shattered by a submarine that hunted them would have profound effects on morale and tactical decision-making. The strategic logic behind targeting destroyers extended beyond immediate tactical considerations. Each destroyer sunk represented not just the loss of one warship, but also the training, experience, and coordination that its crew had developed. Japanese destroyer crews in 1944 varied widely in quality, from veteran units with years of combat experience to newly formed crews with minimal training thrust into combat zones. Veteran crews were particularly valuable because they could operate effectively with minimal supervision, could train newer crews, and could execute complex tactical maneuvers reliably. Losing these veteran crews created gaps in Japanese anti-submarine capabilities that could not be filled quickly by assigning replacement crews, no matter how many destroyers remained in service. USS Harder's aggressive reputation built gradually through several successful patrols. On her first patrol under Dealey's command, Harder sank 2 ships and damaged another, a respectable debut. The second patrol added 3 more confirmed sinks. The third patrol, conducted in the heavily defended waters around the Marianas Islands, yielded 4 sinks, including a destroyer. By early 1944, Harder and her commander had established a reputation within the submarine force as exceptionally aggressive and effective. The crew took pride in their achievements and developed confidence in their commander's tactical judgment, even when his decisions seemed to court unnecessary danger. The crew's confidence in Dealey stemmed from multiple sources. First, his tactics worked. Ships were sunk, the submarine survived, and the crew returned to base with confirmed kills to their credit. Success breeds confidence, and Harder's crew had accumulated substantial success. Second, Dealey led from the front, never asking his crew to take risks he would not take himself. He was always in the conning tower during attacks, making decisions and bearing responsibility. Third, he treated his crew with respect, recognizing their contributions and ensuring that credit for successes was shared. Finally, he maintained discipline and high standards while avoiding the petty tyranny that characterized some submarine commanders. His crew respected him professionally and liked him personally, a combination that produced exceptional unit cohesion. The Japanese, meanwhile, faced an increasingly desperate situation regarding their maritime commerce. Japan's island economy depended absolutely on imports: oil from the Dutch East Indies, rice from Southeast Asia, iron ore from China and Korea, and countless other resources had to reach Japanese home islands by ship. The nation's military forces scattered across the Pacific required constant resupply of ammunition, fuel, spare parts, and reinforcements. This vast maritime network, stretching from Southeast Asia to the home islands and out to forward bases across the Pacific, represented Japan's economic lifeline. American submarines were strangling that lifeline. By spring 1944, Japanese merchant shipping losses had reached catastrophic proportions. The combined fleet had lost numerous warships to submarine attack, including several cruisers and the carrier Shinano. Convoy operations were becoming increasingly hazardous, despite elaborate escort procedures and routing through supposedly safer waters. Japanese anti-submarine capabilities were not keeping pace with the threat. Sonar technology lagged behind American and British standards. Depth charge tactics were often ineffective. Coordination between escorts left gaps that skilled submarine commanders exploited. Training for anti-submarine warfare was inadequate, and experienced crews were stretched thin across too many vessels. The Japanese merchant marine had been inadequate for wartime needs even at the war's beginning, and losses far exceeded replacement construction. Japan entered the war with approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping. By mid-1944, approximately half had been sunk, primarily by American submarines. Japanese shipyards worked frantically to build replacements, but construction rates could not match sinking rates. Moreover, the quality of hastily built wartime merchant ships was often poor, with vessels suffering from mechanical problems and poor seaworthiness. Even ships that survived submarine attacks often required extensive repairs that consumed shipyard capacity and kept them out of service for months. Japanese naval intelligence tracked American submarine operations as best they could, noting which boats were particularly dangerous and attempting to develop profiles of their commanders and tactics. Reports about USS Harder and Commander Dealey caught attention because of the unusual pattern of targeting destroyers. Some intelligence officers took these reports seriously, recognizing that a submarine deliberately hunting their anti-submarine forces represented a significant threat that required special countermeasures. Others dismissed the reports as exaggerated or attributed successful attacks on destroyers to luck rather than deliberate tactics. This latter group viewed the idea of a submarine specializing in destroyer hunting as absurd American propaganda, perhaps intended to boost morale or intimidate Japanese crews. Their mockery would prove premature. The mockery stemmed partly from cultural factors and partly from operational experience. Japanese naval culture emphasized offensive spirit and aggressive action. The idea that their destroyers, the hunters, could be systematically hunted by submarines seemed to contradict the natural order of naval warfare. Moreover, Japanese operational experience in the early war years had shown submarines to be relatively cautious, avoiding combat with escorts when possible, and focusing on merchant shipping. The transformation of American submarine tactics to include aggressive targeting of warships represented a shift that Japanese intelligence was slow to recognize and Japanese commanders slower still to accept. USS Harder was a Gato-class fleet submarine, one of the workhorses of America's underwater campaign against Japan. Laid down at the Electric Boat Company shipyard in Groton, Connecticut in December 1941, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, she represented the rapid expansion of America's submarine force to meet wartime needs. The Gato class embodied the lessons learned from earlier submarine designs, incorporating improvements in diving depth, habitability, range, and reliability. These submarines were not small or cramped like their German U-boat counterparts. They displaced over 1,500 tons on the surface and nearly 2,500 tons submerged. They stretched 311 feet in length with a beam of 27 feet. They were designed for extended patrols in the vast expanses of the Pacific, with bunks for all crew members, air conditioning, refrigeration for food storage, and sufficient fuel and supplies for patrols lasting 2 to 3 months. The construction of a submarine in the 1940s was a complex undertaking requiring precision engineering and meticulous attention to detail. The pressure hull had to withstand enormous forces when diving deep, with any flaw potentially catastrophic. Hundreds of hull penetrations for periscopes, antennas, torpedo tubes, and other systems had to be perfectly sealed against seawater under pressure. Electrical systems had to function reliably in humid, corrosive environments. Diesel engines had to provide power for surface operations and battery charging, while operating efficiently enough to maximize range. Every system had multiple backups, because failure at sea, particularly while submerged, could be fatal. Harder was launched on August 19, 1942, and commissioned on December 2, 1942, with Lieutenant Commander Samuel D. Dealey taking command in August 1943 for what would be her fourth war patrol. The crew consisted of approximately 60 men, though the exact number varied based on mission requirements and whether additional personnel, such as intelligence specialists or extra officers, were embarked. These men lived in remarkably close quarters for weeks at a time, sharing a space smaller than most houses while operating one of the most complex weapon systems of the era. The crew's effectiveness depended not just on individual competence, but on teamwork and coordination, developed through intensive training and refined through operational experience. Life aboard a submarine combined boredom and terror in equal measure. Most of a patrol consisted of transit to and from patrol areas, surface running at night to charge batteries and make better time, submerging during daylight to avoid detection, and endlessly scanning the horizon for targets. The crew stood watches, maintained equipment, ate meals, slept, and tried to pass time in the cramped confines of the boat. Entertainment options were limited to reading, cards, chess, and conversation. Fresh food ran out within days, replaced by canned and dried provisions that became monotonous. The air grew increasingly foul as scrubbers struggled to remove carbon dioxide, and the smell of 60 men in confined spaces accumulated despite best efforts at cleanliness. Then came the terror of combat operations. Approaching a target required nerves of steel and precise coordination. The commander and officers in the conning tower managed the attack, while crew throughout the boat executed orders instantly and perfectly. Torpedomen checked weapons and prepared to fire. The radar operator tracked targets and provided ranges and bearings. The sonar operator listened for escorts and other threats. Electricians managed the batteries that powered the boat while submerged. The helmsman and diving officer maintained depth and trim. Engineers monitored machinery and stood ready to respond to damage or emergencies. Every man had to perform his duties flawlessly because mistakes meant death. The actual firing sequence was a carefully choreographed ballet of technology and teamwork. The commander identified targets through the periscope, estimating range, course, and speed. The fire control party calculated firing solutions, determining the gyro angles for torpedoes to intercept moving targets. Torpedo men flooded tubes and opened outer doors, equalizing pressure carefully to avoid creating sounds that enemy sonar might detect. The commander gave the order to fire, and torpedoes launched with a distinctive jolt as high-pressure air ejected them from the tubes. Then came the agonizing wait, counting seconds until torpedoes reached their targets, hoping for the distinctive sound of explosions that meant hits, dreading the sound of escorts charging toward them with depth charges ready. Dealey trained his crew relentlessly, conducting drills until responses became automatic. He emphasized speed and silence, drilling the crew on crash dives that could take Harder from the surface to periscope depth in less than 60 seconds. He practiced approaches from every angle, training officers and enlisted men alike to think tactically and anticipate enemy movements. Most importantly, he fostered a culture of aggressive confidence. The crew learned to trust their commander's judgment even when his decisions seemed reckless. They understood that aggression, properly executed, was often safer than caution because it gave the enemy less time to respond and forced them to react to Harder's initiative rather than the other way around. The previous patrols had validated this approach. Harder's third war patrol, conducted from February to March 1944, included the sinking of a Japanese destroyer, Ikazuchi, in one of the patrol's most dramatic engagements. The attack required closing to extremely short range and firing a spread of torpedoes that sent the destroyer to the bottom in minutes. This success proved that Dealey's tactics worked, that destroyers could be successfully engaged and sunk despite their speed and anti-submarine capabilities. The crew's confidence in their commander and their boat grew with each successful engagement. By the time Harder departed for her fifth war patrol in June 1944, she was one of the most feared submarines in the Pacific. Her crew was experienced, confident, and aggressive. Her commander had refined his tactics through multiple successful patrols. The submarine itself had been maintained meticulously, with all systems operating at peak efficiency. Everything was in place for what would become one of the most remarkable patrol periods in submarine warfare history. The Fifth War Patrol's assigned area covered waters near Tawi-Tawi, an anchorage in the southern Philippines, where the Japanese combined fleet was staging for operations against the anticipated American invasion of the Mariana Islands. Intelligence indicated heavy naval traffic in the area, including battleships, carriers, and numerous escorts. This represented exactly the kind of target-rich environment that Dealey sought, though it also meant operating in waters heavily patrolled by anti-submarine forces. The risk was enormous, but so was the opportunity. Harder departed Pearl Harbor on May 26, 1944, in company with USS Harder, another fleet submarine. The plan called for coordinated operations, with the two boats supporting each other and sharing intelligence about enemy movements. The transit to the patrol area took approximately 2 weeks, during which both crews prepared for combat operations, checked weapons and systems, and studied intelligence reports about enemy dispositions and tactics. As they approached the operational area, tensions mounted. Every man knew they were heading into dangerous waters, where aggressive Japanese anti-submarine patrols would be hunting for exactly what they were: American submarines trying to disrupt Japanese naval operations. The journey to the patrol area provided opportunities for the crew to prepare mentally and physically for the challenges ahead. Veterans shared experiences and advice with newer crew members. Officers reviewed tactics and contingency plans. The commander briefed the crew on the strategic situation, explaining what was at stake and what they hoped to accomplish. Equipment was checked and rechecked. Every man ensured he understood his duties and responsibilities for various scenarios. The preparation was meticulous, because lives depended on execution being flawless when combat came. The confrontation between USS Harder and the Imperial Japanese Navy's destroyer force represented a clash between two fundamentally different approaches to submarine warfare and anti-submarine operations. The traditional doctrine, adhered to by most naval forces at the time, held that submarines were commerce raiders and opportunistic attackers of warships. They operated best through stealth, striking vulnerable targets and avoiding combat with dedicated anti-submarine vessels. Destroyers, conversely, were designed as submarine hunters, faster and more maneuverable on the surface, equipped with detection gear and weapons specifically designed to kill submerged vessels. The conventional wisdom suggested that submarines that tangled with destroyers were foolish or desperate. Dealey rejected this conventional wisdom through a combination of tactical innovation and psychological insight. He understood that destroyer commanders operated under certain assumptions about how submarines behaved. They expected submarines to be cautious, to break off attacks when detected, to dive deep and run when pursued. These expectations created exploitable patterns. A submarine that behaved differently, that was aggressive rather than cautious, that closed with escorts rather than avoiding them, could achieve surprise even when detected, because the enemy's response would be based on faulty assumptions about the threat they faced. The tactical approach Dealey employed involved several key elements. First, he used superior American radar and sonar to detect targets at long range, giving Harder the initiative in engagements. Fleet submarines carried surface search radar that could detect ships beyond visual range, allowing them to track convoys and position for attacks without being detected themselves. Second, Dealey perfected the technique of approaching targets at periscope depth during daylight, when Japanese lookouts were less effective, and when the low profile of a periscope was nearly impossible to spot against ocean waves. Third, he fired spreads of torpedoes from relatively close range, typically under 1,000 yards, where torpedoes had less distance to run and less time for targets to maneuver, but where Harder was also exposed to immediate counterattack if the approach was detected. Fourth, and most controversially, Dealey often chose to attack escorts before targeting merchant vessels. This violated the conventional calculus that cargo ships represented more valuable targets than warships of equivalent size. Dealey's logic was that eliminating escorts made subsequent attacks on cargo vessels easier and safer, and that sinking warships degraded Japanese anti-submarine capabilities more effectively than sinking merchant ships degraded their logistics. Finally, Dealey remained aggressive even when under counterattack, often staying shallow to observe results and prepare follow-up attacks rather than diving deep and evading as doctrine suggested. The psychological dimension of this approach was crucial. Destroyer crews who believed themselves the hunters suddenly found themselves the hunted. The shock of being attacked by the very quarry they sought demoralized crews and made commanders hesitant. If a destroyer detected a submarine and charged to attack, its commander had to consider whether the submarine might be harder or one of her imitators, deliberately baiting the destroyer into range for a torpedo shot. This hesitation, even momentary, gave submarines precious seconds to maneuver or attack. The psychological advantage multiplied as word spread through the Japanese fleet about the destroyer-killer submarine operating in their waters. Japanese anti-submarine doctrine in 1944 remained relatively unsophisticated compared to Allied practices. Japanese destroyers typically carried Type 93 passive sonar, which could detect submarines, but with less precision and range than American active sonar. Depth charge loads varied, but typically numbered dozens to over 100 per vessel. Japanese depth charge tactics emphasized saturation attacks, dropping large numbers of charges in patterns intended to bracket the submarine's probable location. This approach could be effective but consumed depth charges rapidly, and Japanese logistics struggled to resupply escorts operating far from major bases. The limitations of Japanese anti-submarine warfare became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. Training for anti-submarine operations was inadequate, with many destroyer crews receiving minimal instruction in detection techniques, attack patterns, and coordination with other escorts. The doctrine emphasized aggressive attacks on detected submarines, but provided limited guidance on how to maintain contact with a maneuvering submarine or how to coordinate attacks with other vessels. Communication between escorts was often poor, with limited radio discipline and inadequate procedures for sharing contact information. These weaknesses were not the result of incompetence, but of resource limitations and strategic priorities that favored other capabilities over anti-submarine warfare. The Mark 14 torpedo, once fixed, proved devastating against destroyers despite their speed and maneuverability. A destroyer's thin hull plating, designed for speed rather than protection, offered no resistance to a torpedo warhead containing over 600 pounds of Torpex explosive. A single hit was typically sufficient to sink or cripple a destroyer. Hitting them remained challenging because of their speed and ability to maneuver rapidly, but Dealey's tactic of closing to short range before firing minimized the time available for evasive action. A destroyer traveling at 25 knots could cover approximately 14 yards per second. A torpedo traveling at 46 knots covered approximately 25 yards per second. At a range of 1,000 yards, the torpedo reached the target in approximately 40 seconds, during which the destroyer could move perhaps 500 yards if it maneuvered immediately. By firing spreads of torpedoes aimed at different points along the target's probable path, Dealey ensured that at least some torpedoes would find their mark, even if the destroyer maneuvered. The strategic context for Harder's fifth patrol involved the build-up to the Battle of the Philippine Sea, one of the largest naval engagements of the Pacific War. American forces were preparing to invade Saipan in the Mariana Islands, bringing them within bomber range of the Japanese home islands and threatening to cut Japan's maritime communications with Southeast Asia. The Japanese combined fleet was concentrating at Tawi-Tawi to oppose this invasion, gathering battleships, carriers, cruisers, and destroyers for what Japanese commanders hoped would be a decisive naval battle that would cripple American offensive capabilities and force a negotiated peace. American intelligence tracked this buildup through code-breaking and reconnaissance. Submarines were dispatched to monitor the anchorage, gather intelligence on fleet movements, and attack targets of opportunity. This made the waters around Tawi-Tawi some of the most dangerous in the Pacific for submarine operations. Japanese anti-submarine patrols were heavy, aerial reconnaissance was constant, and fleet units were at high alert. Operating in such an environment required extraordinary skill and courage. It was exactly the kind of challenge that appealed to commanders like Dealey. The concentration of Japanese naval power at Tawi-Tawi represented both opportunity and danger for American submarines. The opportunity was obvious: a target-rich environment where aggressive patrols could potentially sink multiple high-value targets in rapid succession. The danger was equally obvious: waters crawling with anti-submarine patrols, aircraft overhead, and fleet units capable of responding quickly to submarine contacts. Success required perfect execution of tactics, exceptional crew performance, reliable equipment, and considerable luck. Failure meant death for the entire crew, with no possibility of rescue in enemy-controlled waters. The 4 days from June 6 to June 9, 1944, represented the culmination of Dealey's approach to submarine warfare and demonstrated both the potential and the risks of his aggressive tactics. The sequence of events began on the evening of June 6th, when Harder detected a Japanese convoy consisting of 3 destroyer escorts and 3 tankers west of Tawi-Tawi. Most submarine commanders would have attempted to slip past the escorts and attack the tankers, valuable targets whose destruction would deprive Japanese forces of fuel. Dealey chose differently. He maneuvered Harder to position himself ahead of the convoy, then dove to periscope depth and waited for the escorts to approach. The geometry was perfect. The leading destroyer escort, Minatsuki, was coming directly at Harder, providing a nearly zero deflection shot that simplified the firing solution. At approximately 1,100 yards range, Dealey fired a spread of 3 torpedoes. The crew waited in tense silence, counting seconds. Then came the sound of explosions, 2 massive detonations that sent shudders through Harder's hull even at that distance. Minatsuki broke in half and sank in less than 5 minutes. The destruction of Minatsuki was catastrophic and sudden. The destroyer escort, displacing approximately 900 tons, had no chance of surviving multiple torpedo hits. The explosions broke the ship's back, causing immediate structural failure that split the vessel into 2 sections. Both sections sank rapidly, giving crew members little time to abandon ship. Most went down with their vessel, trapped below decks or unable to reach life-saving equipment before the ship disappeared beneath the waves. The few survivors faced the terror of floating in enemy-controlled waters with uncertain prospects of rescue. The other escorts immediately began searching for the submarine, but Dealey had already gone deep and changed course. The Japanese ships dropped depth charges, but Harder was not where they expected her to be. After the immediate danger passed, Dealey brought Harder back to periscope depth to observe. The remaining escorts had abandoned the tankers and were searching frantically for the submarine. The tankers continued on their course, but without escorts, they were vulnerable. Dealey could have attacked them easily, but darkness was approaching, and he chose to save his remaining torpedoes for more challenging targets. The decision to spare the tankers reflected Dealey's tactical priorities. Tankers were valuable targets, and sinking them would have added to his patrol's success. However, tankers were relatively easy targets that could be engaged at any time. Destroyers and destroyer escorts were more difficult targets that required specific tactical situations to engage successfully. With limited torpedoes remaining, Dealey chose to save them for destroyer targets rather than expending them on merchant vessels. This decision illustrated his commitment to his destroyer hunting tactics, even when easier alternatives existed. The next day, June 7th, Harder was patrolling near the entrance to Tawi-Tawi anchorage when radar detected 2 destroyers emerging from the harbor. Intelligence had indicated that destroyer patrols were being increased in response to submarine activity, and here was evidence. The 2 destroyers, Hayanami and Tanikaze, were specifically searching for the submarine that had sunk Minatsuki. They knew roughly where the attack had occurred and were conducting an aggressive sweep to locate and destroy the American boat. Dealey saw an opportunity. Rather than evading the hunters, he positioned Harder directly in their path and dove to periscope depth. The destroyers were zigzagging as they searched, standard anti-submarine procedure, designed to make it difficult for a submarine to achieve a firing position. Dealey tracked their movements patiently, waiting for one of them to present a clear shot. His patience was rewarded when Hayanami steadied on a course that brought her within 900 yards of Harder's position. Dealey fired 4 torpedoes in a carefully spaced spread. The wait seemed eternal. Then came 3 explosions in rapid succession. Hayanami erupted in flames, her back broken by multiple torpedo hits. She began sinking immediately, stern first, disappearing beneath the waves in minutes. Tanikaze, witnessing her sister ship's destruction, did not press the attack. Instead, she began dropping depth charges almost randomly while moving away at high speed, clearly shaken by the sudden violent loss of her companion. Dealey took Harder deep to avoid the depth charges, but they fell nowhere near the submarine's actual position. The psychological impact of these engagements rippled through Japanese naval forces around Tawi-Tawi. Within 48 hours, 2 destroyers had been sunk in quick succession by what appeared to be the same submarine. The boat was not running away or trying to evade detection. It was hunting destroyers deliberately, killing them efficiently and surviving their counterattacks. Japanese commanders faced a dilemma. They needed to increase anti-submarine patrols to protect the fleet anchorage, but sending destroyers to hunt a submarine that specialized in killing destroyers meant risking additional losses. Some commanders argued for concentrating destroyers in groups large enough to overwhelm any submarine through sheer numbers. Others wanted to bring in additional anti-submarine assets from other areas. All agreed that the situation was unprecedented and deeply concerning. The Japanese response to Harder's attacks revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of their command structure. Orders were issued quickly for increased patrols and modified tactics. Communication was effective in disseminating information about the threat. However, the tactical response showed confusion and uncertainty. Some destroyer commanders became overly cautious, spending more time at high speed and less time investigating contacts. Others became more aggressive, pressing attacks with determination born of anger over lost comrades. Neither extreme was optimal. The cautious commanders allowed submarines to operate with less interference. The aggressive commanders walked into traps laid by submarines, employing Dealey's tactics. On June 8th, Harder encountered 3 destroyers conducting an anti-submarine sweep in a coordinated pattern. Fuyuzuki, Uranami, and another destroyer were working together, maintaining visual contact with each other while sweeping the area with sonar. This should have been an ideal anti-submarine patrol, multiple ships working in coordination, maintaining alertness, following proper procedures. Instead, it became a turkey shoot. Dealey observed the patrol from periscope depth, analyzing their pattern and identifying the moment when they would be most vulnerable. As the destroyers turned in their sweep pattern, one of them, subsequently identified as a destroyer similar to Fuyuzuki class, presented a broadside target at approximately 1,200 yards. Dealey fired 3 torpedoes. While those torpedoes were running, he swung Harder's bow to track the second destroyer, which had also turned broadside. He fired 3 more torpedoes at this second target. Within the span of perhaps 2 minutes, Dealey had fired 6 torpedoes at 2 destroyers, while a third destroyer was nearby, and while all 3 were actively searching for submarines. The results were catastrophic for the Japanese. Both targeted destroyers were hit, one by 2 torpedoes and one by a single torpedo. Both began sinking. The third destroyer, rather than pressing an attack on Harder, moved to rescue survivors from the stricken ships. Dealey took Harder deep and cleared the area while the Japanese were preoccupied with rescue operations. By the time they might have organized a coherent search, Harder was miles away. The sinking of 2 destroyers in a single engagement, particularly while a third destroyer was present, represented the peak of Dealey's aggressive tactics. The execution required perfect timing, accurate fire control, and absolute confidence in the crew's ability to perform under maximum stress. The torpedomen had to load and fire tubes rapidly while maintaining silence. The fire control party had to calculate solutions for 2 separate targets within minutes. The entire crew had to maintain depth control and trim while torpedoes were being fired and the boat was maneuvering. Any mistake could have exposed Harder to counterattack or caused the attack to fail. Everything worked perfectly. The final engagement of this remarkable sequence occurred on June 9th. Harder had been ordered to rendezvous with USS Harder to transfer some passengers who had been picked up from a guerrilla operation in the Philippines. As Harder approached the rendezvous point, lookouts spotted a destroyer at long range. This destroyer, later identified as Tanikaze, a different ship from the one encountered on June 7th, showing the confusion in Japanese ship identification during this period, was conducting a patrol pattern that would bring it near the rendezvous point. Dealey faced a decision. He could dive and evade, ensuring he made the rendezvous without incident, or he could attack, risking the mission to eliminate another escort. Characteristically, he chose aggression. He positioned Harder for an approach and dove to periscope depth. The destroyer was zigzagging, but Dealey had studied these patterns extensively and could predict the ship's movements with reasonable accuracy. He waited for the optimal moment, then fired 4 torpedoes. 3 hit. Tanikaze exploded with such violence that debris rained down on the ocean for hundreds of yards around. She sank in less than 3 minutes, so quickly that few crew members survived. Dealey observed the destruction through the periscope, confirmed the kill, and then surfaced to proceed to the rendezvous. The entire action, from initial detection to confirmed sinking, took less than 30 minutes. Harder arrived at the rendezvous on schedule, transferred the passengers to Harder, and prepared to continue her patrol. In 4 days, USS Harder had sunk 5 Japanese warships, 4 destroyers, and 1 destroyer-escort. She had engaged the enemy on their terms, in waters they controlled, against ships specifically designed to hunt submarines. She had survived multiple depth charge attacks and aggressive searches. Most remarkably, she had accomplished this through deliberate, calculated aggression rather than opportunistic attacks on vulnerable targets. The Japanese mockery of the destroyer-killer submarine had transformed into genuine fear. The immediate tactical impact was significant but limited in scope. 5 destroyers represented a meaningful loss to the combined fleet's screen, but Japan still possessed hundreds of destroyers and could, in theory, absorb such losses. The strategic and psychological impact, however, was far more profound. Japanese destroyer commanders became notably more cautious after Harder's rampage. They were less willing to prosecute sonar contacts aggressively, more likely to break off attacks and call for support, and generally more defensive in their operations. This timidity degraded the effectiveness of Japanese anti-submarine efforts across the Pacific. Moreover, the need to protect against aggressive submarines like Harder forced Japanese commanders to allocate additional escorts to convoy duty and fleet protection. These escorts were desperately needed for offensive operations, particularly the planned naval battle against American forces invading the Marianas. The combined fleet sorted from Tawi-Tawi on June 10th, with fewer escorts than optimal, because several had been sunk and others had been diverted to anti-submarine patrol. This contributed to the devastating Japanese defeat in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where American submarines and aircraft destroyed 3 Japanese carriers and shot down hundreds of aircraft in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The technical execution of Harder's attacks deserves examination. Dealey's success stemmed from superior equipment combined with superior tactics. American fleet submarines possessed better radar and sonar than their Japanese counterparts, providing earlier detection and more accurate tracking. The Mark 14 torpedo, once fixed, was reliable and deadly. The submarine's speed and maneuverability were adequate for the tactics Dealey employed, but equipment alone did not account for success. Many submarines had the same equipment and did not achieve comparable results. The difference was in how Dealey used his tools. His approach emphasized patient observation, followed by aggressive action. He would track targets for extended periods, analyzing their movements and identifying patterns. When he attacked, he did so decisively, firing multiple torpedoes to ensure hits and remaining in position to observe results and, if necessary, make follow-up attacks. He trained his crew to execute these attacks with speed and precision, minimizing the time Harder spent exposed at periscope depth. Most crucially, he trusted his instincts and judgment, making decisions rapidly based on incomplete information because he understood that hesitation was often more dangerous than action. The crew's role in these successes cannot be overstated. Dealey provided leadership and tactical direction, but the crew executed his orders with precision and professionalism that made success possible. The torpedo men who loaded tubes, the fire control party who calculated solutions, the sonar operators who tracked targets, the helmsmen who maintained depth and trim, the engineers who kept systems running, all performed their duties flawlessly under conditions of extreme stress. Their training, discipline, and teamwork transformed Dealey's tactical concepts into operational success. The legend of USS Harder and her 4-day rampage against Japanese destroyers raises important questions about the nature of aggressive submarine warfare, the ethics of combat at sea, and the human cost of undersea operations. While Harder's achievements were undeniably impressive from a military perspective, they came at enormous risk and represented a style of warfare that not all submarine commanders could or should emulate. The first question concerns the wisdom of deliberately seeking combat with anti-submarine vessels. Dealey's tactics worked for him and his crew, but they were extraordinarily dangerous. Submarines that engaged destroyers aggressively had higher casualty rates than submarines that focused on merchant shipping and avoided combat with escorts when possible. The submarine force's mission was to strangle Japanese commerce and sink warships when opportune, not to prove points about submarine combat capabilities by taking on the most dangerous possible targets. Some senior submarine force commanders worried that Dealey's example would encourage other commanders to take unnecessary risks. These concerns proved prescient. USS Harder herself was lost on her 6th war patrol in August 1944. Just 2 months after her legendary destroyer-killing spree, she was caught on the surface by Japanese aircraft while operating in shallow waters off the Philippines and sunk with all hands. Commander Dealey and his entire crew perished. Whether Harder would have survived if she had been operating more cautiously is unknowable, But the aggressive approach that made her famous also exposed her to risks that ultimately proved fatal. Of the 80 crew members who served aboard Harder during her 6th patrol, none survived. The circumstances of Harder's loss illustrated the inherent dangers of submarine warfare in shallow, enemy-controlled waters. On August 24, 1944, Harder was operating in Dassault Bay off western Luzon in company with USS Harder and USS Harder when Japanese anti-submarine forces detected the submarines. A coordinated attack involving destroyers and aircraft trapped Harder in shallow water where her options for evasion were limited. Depth charges bracketed the submarine, causing catastrophic damage. Harder went down with all hands, adding 80 more names to the submarine force's casualty lists. The aggressive tactics that had made her famous could not save her when circumstances and luck turned against her. The loss of Harder illustrates the brutal mathematics of submarine warfare. Success required aggression and initiative, but aggression increased risk. The most successful submarines were those whose commanders found the optimal balance, aggressive enough to achieve results, but careful enough to survive. Dealey may have pushed too far on the aggressive side of that balance. His achievements were remarkable, but they cost him his life and the lives of his entire crew. Whether that trade-off was worthwhile depends on perspective and values that have no objectively correct answer. The Japanese perspective on Harder's attacks deserves consideration. The destroyer crews who died aboard Minatsuki, Hayanami, and the other vessels were sailors doing their duty, trying to protect their homeland and comrades against what they perceived as aggression by Western powers. Many had been conscripted and had no particular enthusiasm for war or the militarist ideology that drove Japanese expansionism. They died terrifying deaths, trapped in sinking ships or blown apart by torpedo explosions because of strategic decisions made by leaders they had no power to question. Their courage in continuing to patrol despite knowing about the destroyer-killer submarine operating in their waters was genuine and worthy of respect, even though the cause they served was not. Japanese sources from the period reveal the psychological impact of Harder's attacks. Destroyer crews reported increased anxiety when operating in areas where American submarines had been active. Some captains became notably more cautious, spending less time investigating sonar contacts and more time maintaining distance from potential threats. Morale suffered as news of destroyer losses spread through the fleet. The perception that American submarines were now hunting destroyers rather than avoiding them fundamentally changed how Japanese sailors viewed underwater warfare. The hunters had become hunted, and this role reversal was deeply unsettling. Post-war interviews with Japanese naval officers who served during this period reveal mixed assessments of American submarine tactics. Some expressed professional admiration for the skill and courage required to execute aggressive attacks against escorts. Others maintained that such tactics were unnecessarily risky and that submarines should have focused more exclusively on merchant shipping. Several noted that the psychological impact of destroyer sinkings exceeded their tactical significance, arguing that the fear and caution induced in Japanese destroyer crews was more damaging than the actual loss of ships. The ethics of submarine warfare in general troubled some participants and observers. Submarines operated under a different set of rules than surface ships. The vulnerability of a submarine when detected meant that surfacing to rescue enemy survivors was often impossible without risking the submarine and its crew. Many Japanese merchant sailors died not from torpedo attacks, but from exposure, drowning, or shark attacks after their ships were sunk because submarines could not safely surface to rescue them. This was not unique to American submarines. All submarine forces operated under similar constraints, but it meant that submarine warfare was particularly unforgiving to defeated enemies. The civilian casualties from submarine warfare against merchant shipping were substantial, though less than casualties from strategic bombing or ground combat. Merchant vessels carried not just military supplies, but also civilians, refugees, laborers being transported to work sites, prisoners of war being moved between camps. When these vessels were torpedoed, everyone aboard was at risk. International law required submarines to identify vessels before attacking and to ensure that civilians were evacuated before sinking merchant ships, but these requirements were incompatible with submarine operations in war zones where surfacing meant almost certain destruction. Both sides quickly abandoned these restrictions, and submarine warfare became unrestricted attacks on any vessel in enemy service. The technical achievement represented by submarines like Harder should not obscure the fundamental reality that they were weapons of war designed to kill people and destroy property. The engineering excellence that went into creating a submarine capable of diving to 300 feet, cruising for thousands of miles, and accurately firing torpedoes at moving targets from underwater represents human ingenuity at its finest. But that ingenuity was directed toward destructive purposes. The same skills that created Harder could have built ships to carry trade, vessels to explore the oceans, or craft to advance human knowledge. Instead, they built weapons. This observation is not unique to submarines or to World War II. It applies to all weapons and all wars. But submarine warfare conducted in an environment fundamentally hostile to human life, using weapons that killed invisibly from beneath the waves, perhaps makes the destructive nature of war more apparent. There was little glory in submarine combat, only danger, discomfort, and violence. The men who served in submarines were not seeking adventure or glory in most cases. They were doing difficult, dangerous work because they believed it necessary to defeat an enemy that threatened everything they valued. The question of whether submarine warfare, as practiced in the Pacific, violated norms of civilized warfare was raised during and after the war. The Nuremberg and Tokyo war crimes trials addressed many atrocities, but largely avoided examining submarine operations because all sides had conducted similar operations. American submarines sank hundreds of Japanese merchant vessels without warning. Japanese submarines did the same to Allied shipping. German U-boats operated under similar rules in the Atlantic. No side had moral high ground on this issue, so the question was effectively dropped from post-war reckonings. The comparison with other theaters of submarine warfare illuminates both commonalities and differences. German U-boats in the Atlantic faced more sophisticated anti-submarine defenses than American submarines encountered in the Pacific, including convoy systems protected by numerous escorts, land-based aircraft coverage, and advanced detection technologies like high-frequency direction finding. U-boat casualty rates were horrific, with approximately 75% of U-boat crews dying during the war. American submarine casualty rates, while the highest of any American service branch, were lower, around 22%. This difference reflected both the different operational environments and the different capabilities of opposing forces. The legacy of commanders like Samuel Dealey remains contested. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously for his actions during Harder's 5th Patrol, America's highest military decoration. The citation praised his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity and noted that his aggressive tactics and indomitable determination had destroyed multiple enemy warships. Within the submarine force, he became a legend, an exemplar of the aggressive spirit that characterized the most successful commanders. Schools, ships, and buildings were named in his honor. His tactics were studied and to some degree emulated. Critics, however, argued that Dealey's example encouraged recklessness. The submarine force could not afford to lose boats and crews to unnecessary risks. The mission was to sink Japanese shipping and warships, not to prove tactical theories about submarine combat. Some senior officers worried that younger commanders, inspired by Dealey's fame, would take risks they should not take, seeking glory rather than executing their missions prudently. These concerns had merit, though it is impossible to quantify how many submarines were lost because their commanders were too aggressive versus too cautious or simply unlucky. The debate about appropriate levels of aggression in submarine warfare continues among military historians and submariners. Some argue that commanders like Dealey demonstrated exactly the right balance of aggression and skill, achieving maximum results while accepting calculated risks. Others maintain that more cautious approaches would have achieved comparable results with fewer casualties. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, varying based on circumstances, enemy capabilities, and the specific commander's skills and judgment. What worked for Dealey might not have worked for others, and what he accomplished cannot be simply reduced to formulas that others could follow. The transformation of mockery into terror over those 4 days in June 1944 represented more than just tactical victories or individual acts of courage. It symbolized the evolution of submarine warfare from cautious commerce raiding to aggressive prosecution of enemy forces wherever they could be found. USS Harder and Commander Samuel Dealey demonstrated what was possible when skill, courage, and aggression combined with superior equipment and the willingness to challenge conventional wisdom about how submarines should operate. The Japanese commanders, who initially dismissed reports about a destroyer hunting submarine, learned a painful lesson about underestimating opponents. Their mockery gave way to fear, their confidence to caution. The 5 ships sunk in 4 days represented not just material losses, but a psychological blow that reverberated through the Imperial Japanese Navy's destroyer force. Crews who had considered themselves the hunters of the deep found themselves becoming the hunted, and that reversal changed how they operated for the remainder of the war. For the crew of USS Harder, those 4 days represented the pinnacle of their achievements. They had executed their commander's aggressive tactics flawlessly, sinking 5 warships in rapid succession despite operating in heavily defended waters against ships specifically designed to kill submarines. The confidence and pride they must have felt after those successes is difficult to imagine. They had proven themselves among the elite of the submarine service. Their boat had become legendary, and their commander was being hailed as one of the finest submarine officers in the Navy. Yet their triumph was tragically brief. Just 2 months later, all of them would be dead. Their submarine sunk by Japanese aircraft in the shallow waters off Bataan. The same aggressive spirit that made them successful ultimately contributed to their destruction. Whether a more cautious approach would have saved them is unknowable, but the pattern is clear. Aggressive submarine warfare achieved remarkable results at terrible cost. The line between courage and recklessness is thin, and often visible only in retrospect, after outcomes have been determined by fate, skill, and luck, in measures that can never be precisely calculated. The individual sailors who served aboard Harder deserve remembering as individuals, not just as statistics or crew members of a famous submarine. They were sons, brothers, husbands, and fathers. They came from small towns and big cities across America, brought together by war, and trained to operate one of the most complex weapons systems of their era. They lived in cramped quarters for months at a time, breathing recycled air, eating monotonous food, and facing danger that could end their lives in seconds without warning. They trusted their lives to their shipmates and their commander, and that trust was reciprocated through the bonds that formed among men who faced death together. The Japanese sailors who died aboard the destroyers and destroyer-escorts that Harder sank also deserve recognition as human beings rather than just enemies. They too were sons and brothers, serving their country as duty required. Many were young men with limited training thrust into situations where survival depended on luck as much as skill. When their ships were hit by torpedoes and began to sink, they faced terrifying deaths, drowning in dark, flooded compartments, burning in fuel oil fires, or succumbing to injuries in the water while waiting for rescue that might never come. Their courage in facing these horrors was real, even though the cause they served was profoundly unjust. The strategic impact of submarine warfare in the Pacific theater proved decisive. American submarines, comprising less than 2% of Navy personnel, sank over 50% of Japanese merchant shipping and approximately 30% of Japanese warships, including 1 battleship and 8 carriers. This campaign strangled Japan's economy, cut off resources needed for war production, prevented reinforcement of forward bases, and contributed significantly to Japan's ultimate defeat. The aggressive approach pioneered by commanders like Dealey was part of this success, though it is impossible to quantify precisely how much aggressive tactics versus systematic prosecution of merchant shipping contributed to the final result. The human cost of achieving this success was enormous. 52 American submarines were lost during the war, along with 3,600 sailors. Each loss represented a tragedy for families and communities, pain that echoed through generations. The survivors carried memories of friends who died, of close calls with death, of the sounds and smells and sights of submarine combat that could never be fully communicated to those who had not experienced them. Many struggled with what today would be called post-traumatic stress disorder, though in their era such conditions were poorly understood and rarely treated effectively. The technological legacy of World War II submarines extended far beyond the war itself. The lessons learned about submarine operations, the technologies developed for detection and attack, and the tactical innovations pioneered by men like Dealey all influenced post-war submarine development. Nuclear propulsion eliminated the need to surface for battery charging, making submarines true submersibles rather than surface ships that could submerge temporarily. Guided missiles extended submarines' reach beyond torpedo range. Modern submarines bear little resemblance to fleet boats like Harder, but they evolved from them through decades of incremental improvement building on wartime experience. The story of USS Harder's 4-day rampage against Japanese destroyers endures because it captures something essential about combat at sea: the combination of skill, courage, and calculated risk-taking necessary for success. It demonstrates that conventional wisdom about tactics and strategy can be challenged successfully by those willing to think differently and execute their ideas with precision. It shows that technology alone does not determine victory. How that technology is employed matters as much as its capabilities, and it reminds us that war, however necessary it may sometimes be, extracts terrible prices from those who wage it. The mockery that Japanese commanders initially directed toward the idea of a destroyer-hunting submarine reflected genuine disbelief that such tactics could work. Destroyers were hunters, submarines were prey. The natural order of naval warfare seemed clear, but Dealey and his crew demonstrated that the natural order could be reversed through superior tactics, better technology, exceptional crew performance, and the aggressive pursuit of the enemy, regardless of danger. Their success forced Japanese commanders to reconsider their assumptions and adapt their tactics, though by mid-1944, Japan's strategic position was already hopeless, regardless of tactical adaptations. The lesson extends beyond submarine warfare to military operations generally, and perhaps to human endeavors more broadly. Conventional wisdom exists for good reasons, typically because it reflects accumulated experience about what works and what does not. But conventional wisdom can also become dogma that prevents innovation and improvement. Those willing to challenge accepted practices, to think differently about problems and solutions, can sometimes achieve breakthrough results. The key is distinguishing between bold innovation and reckless disregard for reality, between calculated risk-taking and foolish gambling. Dealey, during those 4 days in June 1944, achieved the former. His tactics worked, his crew executed them flawlessly, and the results were spectacular. That he and his crew died 2 months later, that their aggressive approach may have contributed to their deaths, does not diminish their achievements during those 4 days. It complicates the narrative, adds tragedy to triumph, and forces reflection on costs and benefits. War is not a game where victory is all that matters. The men who fight and die are not game pieces to be sacrificed for strategic objectives. Each loss is a tragedy. Each death cuts short a life with infinite potential. The question of whether Dealey's aggressive tactics were justified depends on values and perspectives that cannot be reduced to simple calculations of ships sunk versus lives lost. What remains clear is that for 4 days in June 1944, USS Harder and her crew demonstrated submarine warfare at its most aggressive and effective. They sank 5 Japanese warships, disrupted enemy operations, and sent psychological shockwaves through the Imperial Japanese Navy's destroyer force. Japanese commanders who had mocked the destroyer killer learned to fear it. Destroyer crews who had hunted submarines confidently became cautious, defensive, less effective. The impact rippled far beyond those specific engagements, influencing Japanese naval operations throughout the remainder of the war. The 80 men who served aboard USS Harder during her final patrol left behind families, friends, and communities that mourned their loss. Many left young widows and children who would grow up without fathers. They paid the ultimate price for their service, and their sacrifice should not be forgotten, even as we question the wisdom of the tactics that placed them in such danger. They were brave men who did difficult, dangerous work in service of their country. They trusted their commander, supported their shipmates, and executed their duties with skill and courage. They deserve to be remembered and honored. Commander Samuel David Dealey left behind a wife and 2 children, along with a legacy that remains controversial within the submarine community decades after his death. He was undeniably brave, skilled, and innovative. He was also aggressive to a degree that some considered reckless. Whether history should remember him primarily as a hero who pushed the boundaries of submarine combat or as a cautionary tale about the dangers of excessive aggression depends on perspective. Perhaps he was both, a man whose strengths and weaknesses were inseparable, whose greatest achievements and ultimate fate stemmed from the same aggressive spirit that defined his command style. The 5 Japanese warships that USS Harder sent to the bottom during those 4 days joined thousands of vessels lost in the Pacific War, each one a tragedy multiplied by the number of crew members who died. The naval war in the Pacific was vast in scale, consuming ships and lives at a rate difficult to comprehend. Harder's victims represented tiny fractions of the total losses both sides suffered. Yet each individual death was absolute and final for those who experienced it. The numbers that make strategic sense, ships sunk, tonnage destroyed, capabilities degraded, represent human suffering on a scale that statistics cannot capture. The transformation of mockery into terror that occurred during those 4 days has become a legend within the submarine community, a story told to illustrate the power of aggressive tactics and bold leadership. It represents an ideal that many submariners aspire to emulate, the commander who takes the fight to the enemy, who refuses to be intimidated by danger, who achieves extraordinary results through skill and courage. Whether that ideal is healthy, whether it encourages appropriate behavior or dangerous risk-taking, remains debatable. But the story endures because it captures something Americans, and particularly American military personnel, want to believe about themselves, that courage, skill, and determination can overcome even the most dangerous enemies. The final word belongs not to analysis or critique, but to simple acknowledgement. USS Harder and her crew went to sea, did their duty, achieved remarkable success, and paid the ultimate price for their service. They were part of a submarine force that made decisive contributions to victory in the Pacific while suffering the highest casualty rate of any American service branch. Their story deserves telling, not to glorify war, but to remember sacrifice, not to celebrate violence, but to honor courage, not to advocate recklessness, but to acknowledge that victory sometimes requires accepting risks that seem unreasonable in hindsight. The mockery transformed into terror, then tragedy. All who served, American and Japanese alike, deserve to be remembered as human beings who faced circumstances they did not create and responded with whatever courage and strength they could muster. Their legacy lives in the freedom their sacrifices helped preserve.